Hi, hello, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for keeping the promise of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development by achieving legal identity for all. My name is Maryann Broxton. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the main representative to the United Nations for the international movement ATD Fourth World, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to put questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we will be monitoring them and answering as many as we can after the speaker's contributions. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted on ATD Fourth World's webpage in the coming days. So please feel free to share it with your friends and your networks and colleagues who could not be joining us this morning. You can find that website in the chat box. Let's get started, shall we? The Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development commits to creating an economic, political, social, cultural, and legal environment that will enable people to achieve social development by implementation of appropriate programs that would entitle and enable people living in poverty and the disadvantaged to participate fully and productively in the economy and society. One major component of enabling people to participate fully is to ensure that every person has access to legal identity. For 30 years after Copenhagen, an estimated 850 million people worldwide lack legal identity. Legal identity is essential to the eradication of poverty and is at the forefront of basic needs, as it provides access to the most fundamental rights: education, health, housing, voting, and social protection systems. Leaving no one behind starts with birth registration for every child, but it also requires that every person has access to civil registration, legal identity that reflects their gender identity, is respective of family history, and provides a pathway to social protection systems. This is how we achieve target 16.9 of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which commits to provide legal identity for all by 2030 and is at the focus of our discussion today. So, knowing that our topic is identity and that people have the right to identify as they choose, it is with pleasure that I ask each of our guest speakers to introduce themselves. Bhaskar, would you please start us off?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Mishra. I work with UNICEF headquarters. I am the technical lead on civil registration, vital statistics, legal identity, and statelessness. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Arli, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Arli Christian, they or she pronouns. I am a senior policy counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, and I've spent many years working on access to identity documents for transgender, intersex, and non-binary people across the United States. And so I'm very happy to be talking about this topic with you all today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Lydia, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Stazen, she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. We're headquartered in Chicago, but we work in partnership with communities all around the world. So delighted to be with you all today and talking about how documentation and legal status really affects people who are experiencing homelessness.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Tiegan, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Tiegan. I'm based within the UK, England specifically. I'm a lived experience advocate, trainer, and consultant based on my lived experience of adoption neurodiversity. I was adopted at the age of 4 years old after 2 years in care, and I have three siblings, all who also experience various kinds of alternative care.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Christian, could you please share with us?
Sure. I'm Christian Courtis. I'm the Gender Advisor and Women's Rights Advisor for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. And I've also worked in many other issues, including economic, social, and cultural rights, SDGs, the rights of persons with disabilities, rights of other persons, among many others. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. It's going to be a wonderful conversation, and we were happy to have you joining us this morning. Christian, we'd like to start with you. Providing birth certificate or legal identity for every human being affirms the inalienable right of all children to have access to a name, an identity, and civil registration. I'm sorry, Bhaskar, we're going to start with you. Can you share the work that UNICEF is currently doing and what needs to be done to ensure birth registration and civil registration is a fundamental right, but also as a means to escape poverty? Bhaskar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maryann, for this opportunity. It's indeed a pleasure. So let me start with the UNICEF Global Report, which was released last year on 16th of December, The Right Start in Life. And I will start with some snippets from the report. So over the past 5 years, from 2019 to 2024, global birth registration rates have risen from 75% to 77%, with more than 500 million children under 5 now registered. The 2 percentage point increase is significant given the devastating effect of COVID-19. To be very honest, we had not expected this kind of rise. The progress reflects the tireless efforts of governments, communities, and organizations such as UNICEF and several others, including ATD, to prioritize birth registration. However, 150 million children under 5 remain unregistered and invisible to government systems, denied access to essential rights and services like healthcare, education, and protection, and therefore put at direct risk of poverty. About 37 million under 1s are also unregistered. The gap between under 5 and under 1 registration rates, with the registration of newborns on a lower side, remains a big concern. The key is to reverse this trend so that no backlog of older unregistered children is generated. Clearing the backlog has become a vicious circle, and that takes away the focus from under 1 registration. Another area that merits urgent focus is the gap between registration and certification. Although the gap has reduced over the last 5 years, still 55 million under 5s and 16 million under 1s registered children lack a birth certificate. So that means they don't have proof of their births registered. In terms of geographical coverage, Sub-Saharan Africa, with only 51% of children registered and home to over half the world's unregistered children, remains a priority area. South Asia, with nearly 30% of unregistered children, also needs to accelerate to register the birth of these children. Additionally, there are several countries across regions that need last-mile strategies to reach universal birth registration coverage. Reaching out to those children, mostly comprising vulnerable and marginalized ones, including refugees, IDPs, and stateless, is key to the Leave No One Behind agenda that Maryann mentioned right. Let me take this opportunity to present UNICEF's contribution to these regions. We have been working closely with more than 80 countries on CRBS and legal identity-related interventions. In the past 3 years, we played a key role in registering the births of 144 million children. Of these, 127 million children, which means 88% of them, were also issued birth certificates, thanks to our emphasis on a one-stop approach to registration and certification. If you look at the practices in several countries, including Kenya and Rwanda, registration and certification are done in multiple steps, and there are fees even for the first copy of birth certificate. The legal requirement for birth registration has expanded to 147 countries, up from 69 in 2017, a big jump. Births are now registered without discrimination in 104 countries, up from 56 in 2017, a long distance to go. While the progress presents a sobering reality, it also serves as a call to action as we have entered the last 6 years of the decade of action, the 2030 agenda. We know what works. Proven strategies like decentralizing services to bring registration closer to communities, integrating registration services with health and social protection systems, digitalizing processes for efficiency and eliminating fees have consistently shown results. For example, Tanzania's simplified and decentralized system now operates in all 26 mainland regions, increasing birth certification coverage from less than 13% in 2016 to over 60% in 2022. Similarly, Ivory Coast leveraged maternal and newborn healthcare to integrate birth registration, boosting rates to over 90% by 2021. There are several more promising examples. I can go on and on. So what are the challenges ahead? From cultural norms and lack of political will to logistical barriers like cost and distance, these obstacles require innovative and tailored solutions. For example, Chart's FastJIL system, a digital registration platform, ensures accessibility in remote areas and supports mobile registration units. Such innovations, coupled with community-based efforts, can bridge the gaps for underserved populations, including ethnic minorities, refugees, and those in rural areas. But this work goes beyond numbers. Legal identity is foundational to human rights and development. It safeguards children against exploitation and ensures their access to services while also providing governments with vital statistics for effective policymaking. Birth registration, as Maryann mentioned, is the cornerstone of civil registration and vital statistics systems, supporting not just SDG 16.9, but also contributing to multiple other sustainable development goals, including those focused on health, education, and poverty reduction. As we look to the future, our focus must remain sharp. We need accelerated progress, especially in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, where population growth threatens to outpace current gains. We must advocate for inclusive legal reforms, build interoperable systems that link health, education, and social protection sectors, and ensure that digitalization efforts prioritize accessibility and equity. Community engagements will be key, empowering families to demand birth registration as a right and fostering partnerships across all sectors and levels of society. The 2030 Agenda calls on us to leave no one behind, and SDG 16.9 offers us a tangible, achievable goal. Let us draw inspiration from successes, leverage the tools and strategies that work, and commit ourselves to ensuring that every child, everywhere, has the right start in life, a legal identity that opens the door to opportunity and protection and becomes a guardrail against poverty. Thank you very much. Over to you, Maryann.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's amazing that you said 144 million kids have been registered in the past 3 years. I really appreciate the idea that decentralizing services, bringing the services to people in communities that might be alienated or far out and rural in access, and the idea of integrating it from the very beginning when you're providing health services to women that are expecting, to let them know now this is what we also the next natural step. That sounds like wonderful work, and we really appreciate that. Ari, we would like to turn to you now and ask about what are some of the difficulties that people that are transgender experience in obtaining an ID that reflects their current gender identity and who they are as a person. How these difficulties can push an already marginalized group deeper into poverty, and how can we ensure legal identity for transgender people who currently lack an ID? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Bhaskar, for setting the stage. We're moving now from looking at birth certificates and identity documents at birth to making sure that people have access to accurate identification throughout their life that matches who they are, right? So when we think about our transgender, intersex, and non-binary populations across the world, we need to make sure that individuals have access to an identity document that matches who they are for a number of logical reasons, right? That makes sure that people can obtain work, make sure they can travel, make sure they are safe when they're interacting with law enforcement, when they're using facilities, when they're entering locations. So I'll start maybe with the ideals and values around making sure people have access to identity documents that match who they are. And then I'll go into some of the difficulties we're experiencing right now. And I can highlight what's happening in the United States as an example of that. But starting off with some ideals and values that every country should aspire to make sure that your trans, intersex, and non-binary populations have access to accurate identity documents that are usable in the world, right? So here are some ideals. One, self-determination and self-certification of gender. So this is really important. So an individual themselves knows best what marker is most appropriate to be on their identity document when they're showing it out in the world, right? They know what will keep them safe. They know what will allow them to get that job without someone discriminating against them, harassing them, go through a checkpoint without issues, etc. If you put in place medical or judicial hurdles, someone has to go to a judge, someone has to have certain medical procedures, it means that people who don't have the money to do those things cannot access an accurate ID, right? It means that people who may not be able to obtain certain medical procedures for whatever reason can't get that ID that matches who they are. So self-determination. The types of sex designations or gender markers that are available on your country's identity documents. So generally, the gold standard right now is to have an M available, an F available, or an X available. And this means that any individual, whether they have a male or female gender, or whether they are a non-binary individual, intersex individual, want some additional privacy around their gender, they can get a marker on their ID that feels safest and most appropriate for them, again, to be able to interact in the world. And so having that array of markers available for individuals is a best practice to ensure that everyone can get an accurate marker or have privacy around their marker. We talk a lot about people should have privacy about what their sex assigned at birth may have been, and it's really important for their safety and for their security and their ability to interact in the world that they have that privacy. So having options on their national ID is very important. And then the third ideal that countries should look at is when and where is it appropriate and necessary to have sex designations on identification, right? Is that a necessary data point to put on there? Does the government need to know at that moment in time what someone's sex designation is? So we should be thinking about pieces like, currently the International Civil Aviation Association requires that we have sex designations on all of our country's machine-readable passports, for example. Maybe we should be working to remove that requirement, right? So that countries can make their own determination of, is this a data point that we even think is appropriate as a country to put on our passports? So those are some of the bigger ideals of what it looks like to have policies that really support and ensure our trans, intersex, and non-binary people have access to passports, and so that they can, go to work safely, travel safely, interact with law enforcement. And we know that trans populations are disproportionately affected by poverty, by homelessness, by lack of employment. And so policies like these are an important piece of ensuring that our populations are safe and able to interact in the world. And I wanted to touch just a little bit on the difficulties we're facing here in the United States around legal identity. And as folks may have seen in the last 3 weeks, we used to have these gold standards of access to accurate ID on the federal level. And in the last 3 weeks, we have turned them on their head and really lost our access to accurate passports and national identification that matches individuals. We got an executive order from President Trump on day one of his presidency that said that essentially attempting to define sex in a way that defined transgender, intersex, and non-binary people out of existence. Now, obviously, we all still exist, but that is what the executive order attempted to do. And it had a lot of effects, many, many effects that we are still feeling and sorting out through the country. It is a very, very difficult time in the United States right now for our trans, intersex, and non-binary populations. But one of the effects of this order was that the federal government has stopped issuing updates to gender markers on US passports. Overnight, this happened. They have also stopped issuing X designations on US passports. The mandate they have right now is that all US passports must reflect an individual's sex at birth. Now, this is a very harmful policy for all of the reasons I just talked about. My organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, has just sued the administration and President Trump for this unlawful violation of our rights. I actually wanted you all to hear directly from one of the plaintiffs who is featured in our suit. So I'm just going to share this short video very quickly, and then I will pass on the mic.
It's official, y'all. I am working with the ACLU to sue the Trump administration. Now, you're probably wondering, why on earth am I suing Donald Trump? Well, you may or may not have seen this video that went kind of viral. So yes, I'm a transgender woman. I applied to renew my passport and have it marked as female, and they refused, and they sent it back to me as male. He does not get to tell me who I am. Only I do. And now I'm at high risk of something bad happening to me if I were to travel abroad. This policy is dangerous, and it is unfair to every single trans, non-binary, or intersex person that there is. I'm an American, and yes, I'm transgender, but I deserve to be able to travel freely without fear or repercussion. We deserve the freedom to be ourselves, and no politician should be able to take that away. This is just a small part of a broad effort by the Trump administration to push trans people out of public life and act like we don't exist. They want to ban our healthcare, censor our speech, control our lives, and I'm not just gonna sit there and let it happen. We're not going to sit here and let it happen. We deserve better than this because all people deserve better than this. And Donald Trump, we'll see you in court.
So that is one of our incredible plaintiffs, Zaya, in our lawsuit. And I just wanted to give you that sense of what is happening on the ground here in the US. It is a really precarious time for our community, but one that we will, continue to step up and fight back. Every person in the United States deserves legal identity, the ability to have an identity document that matches who they are so they can participate in society, and we will fight for that. So that is it from me. Back to you, Maryann.
Thank you so much for that, Arli. I really appreciate the contrast between what Bhaskar was talking about, legal identity and the needs for it, and what the experience is for people in the United States. The idea that how your identity is considered is based on where you are located. It's something different to each person. I also like the idea, appreciate talking about the gold standard. If everybody had a gold standard of the designation or M, F, or X, because it's really safety, and that it's a best practice to ensure safety for people, and how you brought it right back to again, but we'll be talking about it soon too, also, is that it's a human right to be identified as to have a legal identity that reflects how you want to be seen and how you see yourself. So I appreciate that, and thank you for sharing what's going on the ground. Now I would like to turn to Tiegan. And ask you to share for a little bit with us, if you could. We know that you are a young activist who speaks from personal experience about the care system in the UK. Could you share how family separation by the state can affect legal identity for people and the relationship that this has to poverty?
Thank you for the question. In the UK, it is estimated that 1 in 30 children are in care, meaning any sort of alternative care within either your birth parents' care or your birth family, or care homes or state-run places that could be foster care. Poverty is at the root of a care system in the UK. For example, my hometown is apparently one of the most deprived areas in the UK, which is quite shocking because we look affluent, but we're not. Poverty is probably a massive reason why I ended up in care and was eventually adopted. I think both my birth parents came from a background of poverty. My birth mum wasn't in a position to look after me when I was born. She was young, There was a lot going on in her life, and there had been some issues. So my birth dad became a single parent. Eventually, there was some more concerns with him as well, partly due to the challenges that I think he faced, but a lot of them could be linked to poverty, including the poor housing choices made for us. I spent 2 years in foster care and I was adopted after I turned 4 years old. When you're adopted within the UK, you're a sort of a new person. Your original birth certificate becomes invalid, and you get an adoption certificate. Your adoptive parents are now your parents. It's a massive thing to have lost, what most people hold as a birth certificate, and what that can mean in terms of connection and identity, if it's not of your own choosing. Another way poverty, state family separation, and legal identity intersects is accessing records and health history. For example, in the UK, we have our records, our files. Everyone will say accessing them is one of the most challenging things ever because they come to us very redacted, which means that large sections are just blacked out. These files may be the only chance to find out certain information. When I spoke to my birth dad about this, he was very honest. He said, "I want you to have everything on me. I want my parts unredacted." He contacted them. He needed 2 forms of ID and then something else. I think maybe 3 forms of ID. Again, he is a guy in poverty and hasn't left the country in over a decade. He doesn't own his own place and doesn't have any bills to his name. He had nothing. He went back and said he doesn't have any of those. We even suggested to do a DNA test as I could prove who I was. We got a very straight up no. He wants my files to be unredacted if that's what I want, but he just isn't able to make it happen because he doesn't currently have all these forms of proof that he legally is who he is due to poverty. I also don't have access either to my early year health history or my birth family health history. You lose all that sort of legal identity. Me and my adoptive parents got to know some of the very basics when I was adopted, including I had meningitis. But other than that, there isn't any history between the ages of 0 and 4. I don't have a right to that knowledge because the state doesn't legally see me as that person anymore. Legally, it's seen as that person's history or identity, so I don't have a right to know. This is my experience with legal identity, but I'm not alone in this experience. From the statistic I mentioned at the beginning of my statement and the stories I've heard through my work, my adoptive parents are loving and caring people who provide a safe environment and home when I needed it, and we are a family. But you shouldn't have to sacrifice aspects of your legal identity and history or have it severed by the state to be supported or to be kept safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiegan, for sharing of your personal history and how it relates to everybody else that has the same experience and going through the same thing. I really appreciate the idea that you were not able to find some of your identity and history because your father was not also able, your birth father was not also able to prove his identity due to poverty. So again, identity being blocked by the state and sharing of information being blocked by the state. And I really appreciate the contrast of what Arli was saying back, how people are saying, this is who I want to be identified as, and the state saying, no, this is who we see you as. And the state also denying your history of saying, yes, but yes, I am adopted, but that history is still part of me, health records, family connections that could know with what I'm experiencing now, and the state saying, no, you're not that person anymore. So there's connections all the way around here, and I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn to Lydia and ask about, we know that legal identity for people is, as has been said so far, access. It's a gateway to get in, and we know that people that are experiencing homelessness sometimes can lose possessions. Possessions can be confiscated and taken away. Could you share with us some of the difficulties people that are currently experiencing homelessness have around legal identity and what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a really short PowerPoint to share if that's okay.
That'd be perfect.
Okay. Pulling it up on the screen now. Can you let me know when you see it?
One moment. We can see it if you could enlarge it because my eyes are not that great.
Great.
You'll see
So
me squinting.
thanks again for having me. I'm the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness, and I'm also the co-chair of the UN NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, of which you're part, Maryann, as well. So I always like to start out any conversation with just kind of a quick setting of terms. What is it that we mean when we are talking about homelessness? One of the things that IGH and the working group advocate for is a really broad and inclusive definition of homelessness. And so if you look at that top bar in green, we're talking about people literally without accommodation, maybe sleeping on the street or in places not meant for humans to live in, people living in temporary or crisis accommodation like homeless shelters, B&Bs like they have in England, etc. And then also people living in severely inadequate and insecure accommodation. And the reason that we talk about homelessness in these different categories is because the types of housing, the types of services that you need might be different based on what type of housing insecurity you're experiencing. But regardless of which of these categories of homelessness or housing insecurity you're experiencing, generally speaking, around the world, your legal documentation is your pathway into accessing those housing and services. This is a snapshot of where IGH partners around the world. So we have communities where we work in deep partnerships across all 6 continents. And I'm sharing this map with you because in 2022, we worked with some partners at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland and Bremen GISS in Germany. And they did a globally comparative research study on the enablers to success in terms of addressing homelessness, as well as some of the barriers. So how our communities around the world, regardless of context, culture, resource base, what's working to end homelessness and what isn't working to end homelessness. And so they came up with a list of things that were barriers to addressing homelessness and a list of things that helped communities move forward and make really good progress in addressing homelessness. One thing that came out across every single community where we partner was that lack of documentation and, identity paperwork was a massive barrier to people accessing housing and services. And so, again, around the world, we saw that this was a barrier both for citizens as well as for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. It makes it difficult to access emergency shelter, makes it difficult to access food, social services, health services, including vaccinations, temporary housing, permanent housing, vouchers, subsidies, rental or utility assistance. Communities told us it was a barrier to job training and employment opportunities, as well as any kind of rental or utilities assistance. So if you cannot show that documentation, that identification paperwork, it's extremely difficult to get the type of support that you need to become stably housed. I just wanted to share, kind of some voices from the city. So again, we heard from our colleagues in Tshwane, South Africa, kind of this idea around the definitions of homelessness. So who qualifies for the types of support that the government offers to people who are homeless? So we see that kind of barrier there for people who are cross-border migrants. From our colleagues in Bengaluru, India, if you're going to access food, cash support services, and they also require a down payment there. So again, if you're going to access these services, not only do you have to have the documentation, but you also have to have a cash down payment as well. I also like, to show colleagues that these are not just issues in, countries in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia. These are part and parcel of the work in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom and places like that as well. So again, in Chicago, where I'm from, some shelters don't require that, but others do require it. So again, it's very kind of patchwork in terms of what people can access. And again, our colleagues from Canada saying you've got to have the permanent address before you get any basic services. So they're just not going to provide supports to you unless you can prove your identification and have that permanent address. In Croatia, one interesting kind of nuance that came out was there's even resistance to serving people who maybe are not from that particular community. This is true in the UK as well. You have to prove like a local connection in order for the council to provide you those kinds of services. So again, you know, if your documentation shows that you're from a different part of the country, you might not be able to receive services there. So again, just some key takeaways. This is problematic across the globe. Lack of documentation and identification paperwork blocks people from accessing both basic emergency humanitarian services as well as their pathways to future stability. This is true for citizens and in-country migrants, but also external migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We also saw how it was justified by saying we need to manage our resources effectively or guard against abuse of the system, which is again sort of this global myth that people are taking advantage of all these services that that governments offer to them. And so again, a huge block that came through from our comparative research, and it really needs to be addressed through both policy changes, but also programmatic changes. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for sharing that. I really appreciate how you showed that it is universal when the countries you named, South Africa, India, US, Canada, in countries in Latin America and Croatia. So this is something, the access to ID, having access to documentation or ID can prevent you, and it stands as the barrier, the guard from letting people into programs that they would need in order to have housing. I appreciate the research when you were talking about healthcare, training, work supports, all of these things. It acts as a guard and a barrier in preventing people. So I really appreciate that of your sharing. Thank you so much. Christian, we would like to turn to you now. Every person is born with an inalienable human rights. But as we've heard so far, institutional roadblocks can prevent or deny people from accessing them. Could you please offer an overview of legal identity in the context of fundamental human rights and the work currently being done by OHCHR to ensure that and protect these rights?
Sure. Perhaps what I can do is summarize a little bit, also picking up on some of the points that were already made from the human rights viewpoint. So maybe 3 big points. I think that the first one is this is an area where there's convergence between the normative framework of human rights and the SDGs and other development documents, including the outcomes of the World Summit on Social Development. And that's I mean, you can tailor the argument to literally convert literal convergence. So human rights norms include the in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a universal right that everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, and probably more detailed wording in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has practically universal recognition or universal ratification, which says, Article 7 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child says, the child shall be registered immediately after birth and shall have the right from birth to a name, the right to acquire a nationality, and as far as possible, the right to know and be cared by his or her parents, and states shall ensure the implementation of these rights in accordance with their national law and their obligations under the relevant international instruments in this field, in particular where the child would otherwise be stateless. If there's some guidance on that, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has issued many general comments, but starting with one general comment 7 on implementing child rights in early childhood, where there are some clarifications on the extent, the scope of these obligations. I mean, as it was said by Bhaskar, SDG 16, which generally is on peace, justice, and strong institutions, has a specific target target 16.9 by 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. So there is a substantive convergence on both. Most countries in the world are part of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. A big proportion are parts of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Many regional human rights treaties covering regions such as Africa, Europe, and the Americas also include in the regional treaties different formulations of these rights. But at the same time, all of the countries of the world unanimously have adhered to the SDGs and have committed politically to the same goal. So there's no discussion on the normative basis of this. I think a second point that came out is in the wording of human rights meant by the idea of interdependence and indivisibility. And in the SDGs, it has also been mentioned as the interconnectedness of the SDGs. The right to legal registration has to do with legal identity, so it has a value in itself, but it's also instrumental for the exercise and enjoyment of many other rights. So the point made by Lydia is many rights, including access to housing, access to food, social security, access to health, access to education, have as a tenet the requisite of legal registration, or legal registration has been instrumental for the enjoyment of these rights. And the flip side of that is that the lack of legal registration has been a barrier in order to enjoy those rights. In the SDG framework, there are some little interconnectedness. For example, Goal 17 of the SDGs, which talks about means of implementation, include a specific target, 1718, which requires countries by 2020, by 2030, enhance capacity building support to developing countries, to increase the availability of high quality, timely, and reliable disaggregated data disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, geographic location, and other characteristics in national context. There's a direct connection of the production and disaggregation of data and birth registration as a means for that. So people legally exist through birth registration, and that's a way of incorporating people into national statistic data. But then, as mentioned by Bhaskar, many other SDGs, SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 2 on hunger, SDG 3 on health, SDG 4 on education, SDG 6 on water and sanitation, SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy, SDG 8 on decent work, SDG 10 on reducing inequalities, SDG 11 on sustainable cities and housing, SDG 12 on responsible consumption, among others, are directly related to birth registration. So the point there is legal registration is a value in itself because it has to do with identity and it has to do with autonomy, but at the same time it's instrumental for the enjoyment of other rights, and is also instrumental to the enjoyment of sustainable development in its different economic, social, and environmental aspects. And I think the third point that came out in the discussion was the fact that birth registration also requires to comply with certain standards. So the golden rule in the human rights terms, we would say birth registration should be in line with human rights standards, and two standards that come clearly in what we heard have to do with, one, the respect for autonomy, self-determination, and self-perception are part of this idea of autonomy, of decisions regarding oneself have to do with one's will and decision. And the second one is respect of privacy and the possibility of exercising different aspects of legal identity and legal recognition through that process. So some of the examples regarding the lack of matching of gender identity with documentation are good examples of the lack of respect of autonomy and self-perception. And the second and the examples given by Tiegan are also examples of how legal hurdles and legal systems prevent people from their autonomy, the right to privacy, and the right to recognize their own history, past and history. So I think in human rights terms, there's a strong convergence of legal obligations and commitments that come from the sustainable development and social development framework. That's, I would say, OHCHR's recipe for the compliance with SDGs, which is that the best way to comply with the SDGs is following human rights standards, and there's lots of guidance about that in the human rights system. So I'll stop there. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much for that, Christian. And I really appreciate how you laid it out, that legal identity is part of every single one of the SDGs, and it's woven throughout them because it leads to access, and reminding people that there's actually covenants when we talk about this that were signed, and declarations that each child is to be registered for birth, and also bringing it back to its autonomy, its enjoyment of things that we should be having in life as people, being able to access work, being able to access food, being able to access housing, to access safety, the right that people have. So I really appreciate that these are the things that people are supposed to enjoy that are human rights for people. So now what I would like to do is open up the floor to all of the panelists at the moment and talk about, have some questions. And I know that Bhaskar put in the chat, at least 12 SDGs and over 60 indicators need data for civil registration. So that's a point to talk about. And now we'd like to turn to all of you that are listening to our webinar today and see if there are any questions that you would like to ask for our panelists, or anything that we'd like to expand upon a little bit more, or maybe go a little bit deeper into and talking about with people. I see a hand raised. One moment. I'm sorry, I'm reading. Okay.
It's Christian. It was
yes.
I mean, just a point on Lydia's point on the Croatian example. So in fact, that was my third point, that the need to have legal registration in line with human rights norms. In fact, in many, there's some traditions, and I would say two, the Eastern Bloc tradition, the communist tradition, and also the apartheid South African tradition, had the use of legal registration as a way to restrict rights. So in the tradition of the Soviet Union and the communist countries, that was called papriska, the idea that your rights were basically linked to your residency registration, and that was a barrier to exercise rights anywhere else. So that was a way of physical control of people, and control of people regarding their freedom of movement. And it was exactly the same in apartheid South Africa. So it's not a matter of left or right. So authoritarian regimes tend to use legal registration actually as a way to control people. So that means that legal registration might also have this double sword, double-edged sword. So that's I think that goes in the line of my third point, which is legal registration needs to follow human rights standards, and that is not using legal registration as a basis to exclude people from the exercise of their rights. Over.
Thank you for that. Arli, I know, would you like to comment on about having the X designation on passports?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. So for folks who can't see, the question is, could a gender identity of X on a passport function to allow people in other countries to assume that someone has a non-traditional gender identity in the same way that having an incorrect gender assignment on passports would? Would this still open LGBTQ plus individuals to harassment and discrimination in other countries? And that's a great question, because I think there is a lot of sort of fear and some kind of misunderstanding around what an X designation is. This goes back to that first principle I talked about of self-determination, right? That every individual themselves know best what is safest and most appropriate for them to walk around with. So when you think about an X designation, for some individuals, that is the safest and most appropriate option. And it matches who they are. It either, it matches their identity, or it matches their gender expression, right? And for some individuals, if they have an M or an F on their passport, that is disclosing sensitive information about their sex at birth, their private information about their bodies that they don't want disclosed to the public, right? So we really have to think about whether that is the safest option for that individual. And I think there's a lot of trepidation around an X designation, particularly because we still do have a society that is in many places divided by gender, and we have male facilities and female facilities, and no one's trying to tear that down and make that go away. So I think we always have to assure folks, that's still very much one of the facets of our society, and that's okay. But for every single individual to be safe in that environment, they need to be able to make the determination of what should be on my documents to make me safe, right? Our society should function based on keeping individuals safe and on how we all behave as individuals, not on policing each of our genders, right? So I say that to say people have fears around same-sex facilities, for example, and behavior in same-sex facilities. If any individual goes into a women's restroom and causes harm and does something illegal, they are doing something illegal and they must be arrested, right? Otherwise, they are trying to use the facilities and go to the restroom, right? And so we have to keep that in mind and not try to police how individuals look and their gender expression according to where they can, where they're allowed to go. So I say all that to say, an X designation may be appropriate for some people, may keep them safe. For other people, it may not, and it may be a target. And that's something that each individual is best suited to make the decision about for themselves.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing and explaining that. We have another question, and which states, in 24 countries, national laws deny women's right to confer on their children, and in over 40 countries, women that cannot confer on a non-citizen spouse. Could the panel comment on the impact of this on access to legal identity and link with women's inability to equally and independently access civil documents based on their gender and marital status?
Can I?
Please do.
So I know Catherine very well, and thank you, Catherine, for raising this question. UNICEF has been closely working with Catherine and others to address this gender inequality in nationality laws. And let me tell you something, and this would be a good piece of information. So 2 weeks ago, I participated in a meeting with the government of Kuwait. Okay, and in Kuwait, what happens? Non-citizens, their births are not registered. Okay, if they don't have passport or permanent residency. And what really surprised me was that if a migrant or non-citizen, if they have a baby and they're not married, in less than 30 days, all three are deported from the country. All three, the mother, the father, and the baby. And also, if a baby is born to a Kuwaiti mother and a non-Kuwaiti father, then when he or she turns 21, then her status changes from a citizen to permanent residency. Okay, and I can go on and on. So this is a big problem, in those countries. the sad situation is that when you go and talk to them, you will find a bit of rigidity, and then a lot of factors coming, like Syria and all other things, like the local context. So that no doubt remains a context, a concern. And because of that, yes, universal birth registration or legal identity, unless we take care of those issues, it's going to be extremely difficult, whatever we might say here and there. So those things need to be sorted out on priority. And I completely agree with you, Catherine. And then you have, because if you look at the civil registration laws, I'm talking about CRBS laws. Even CRBS laws has, like gender issues. Mothers are not empowered to be a declarant, like in several countries. So father has to be there. In case of unwed and single mothers, like they won't register the name of the baby unless the father comes. Okay, so a whole lot of issues. And then, because if you look at the best practices of civil registration, it says that the civil registration practices need to align with national laws. But in several countries, national laws are not aligned with international recommendation and best practices. And then you have instances of de facto discrimination. So even if you have laws, when it comes to actual implementation, the ground realities are entirely different. Look at what happens in Nepal. Like the Palika registers, they grossly violate, like even Supreme Court judgments. So a comprehensive, what we have been recommending from our side, that guys, whatever laws you have, you need to educate your civil registrars because they are the implementers on the ground. It doesn't matter, like whether your registrar general is fully aware of those things, like that's fine, that's good. But unless those things percolate down to actual registrars, then the common people will continue facing these challenges. Okay. I've worked in India. I was Deputy Registrar General India for 5 years from 2007 to 2012. Before I moved to UNICEF, I've worked in Africa. I closely interact with 45 to 50 countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, countries in South Asia, Cambodia, like countries in Africa. I can tell you this is one conversation all of us, we need to pay more attention to. Thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think you just said the most important part, implementation, because we can fix rules and fix laws, but if we don't educate people to implement these laws correctly to make sure people are not being discriminated against then people will still be left out. Lydia, I see that you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this question a little bit because we know from our colleagues in Africa, parts of Asia, and parts of Latin America that a huge driver of women's homelessness is they're not allowed by the law to inherit their husband's land if he passes away. And so I think while it's not exactly legal identity, it is an inability to have that kind of right conferred to you because of your gender.
Thank you for sharing that. Christian, please, I see you have your hand.
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating question, and I mean with 2 or 3 points. One is, I mean, these are clearly discriminatory laws. This is direct discrimination because these are laws that project the idea that the breadwinner is the male and the wife needs to follow the situation of the male. So it's discriminate. It's distinct treatment on the basis of gender. So clearly this is discriminatory laws. The whole area of nationality laws has lots of issues regarding these issues. Traditionally, they have been seen as a space of national sovereignty. We see the US case these days, which will directly create statelessness for children born in the US. But perhaps the second point is many countries in the world are at the same time part of the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So these are the kinds of issues that needs to be raised to the committee in order to have the committee make recommendations to modify these laws. So there's spaces to bring these issues up and to document the way in which this infringes the rights both of women and of children. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I see, Bhaskar, you have your hand one more
So
time?
I just wanted to add, what Kristen said. We have been interacting very, very closely with CRC committee members. Okay, and so I think it's time that CRC committee members, they need to add either more teeth or more sharpness to their existing teeth. Okay, because you go wherever you go, like even in case of Kuwait, like there are tons of recommendations, but the follow-up is very slow, extremely slow. With that pace, I don't think we will be able to achieve anything, like forget about the next 6 years, maybe, like even in next 26 years. So these are areas where we have to work. But then I also want to raise a couple of points. Civil registration evolves the way society evolves. Okay. So if you are expecting, like, and please don't get me wrong, because I have seen countries, like when it comes to the third sex, no, complete no. Then there are countries, like that slowly and gradually they have started moving in that direction. In early 2000, the population census, they agreed that, like in their population census questionnaire residuals, there would be a third sex. So even in India, like if you look at the birth registration declaration form, like there are three sexes, like male, female, and third. And other countries are also moving in the direction. But if a baby is born in a health facility and his or her birth is registered immediately after birth, then naturally they will go for, like what comes or what be known as the biological sex. But then after that, there should be adequate provisions in the law, like, and there comes the question which Arli and others were, like talking about. Okay, so that is one area. But then if you look at the normative framework of civil registration, the United Nations Statistical Division principles and recommendation and other documents, they are like, the guidance books. So it's also important for, like the policy actors and those, like advocates and all to also engage with them, like please come up and raise your points. Because if you look at the principles and recommendation when it comes to adoption, exactly they say that, hey, in case of adoption, they need to get an order from the court, then the name of the adoptive parents have to be there, and then depending on, like the kind of laws a country has, like they might not even declare, like the name of biological parents, even if a baby turns 18 and when, like that baby has all the right under this, under the sun to know exactly who are aware, like his or her biological parents. So this is quite a complicated space, but I can tell you on civil registration cannot stand in isolation. On one side, you have the health sector. On the other side, you have national ID. So even if you are asking civil registration system to change, but if the national ID system or the health sector, like if they don't change, then you will find that, like it's going to be extremely difficult. I'm giving you a bit of practical solution. Okay, that guys, this is not only about civil registration. This is about, like how the overall society thinks and they do things. Thank
Thank you for that. I really appreciate like these to add into that is the overall society and how people can change over time. Where people consider it more progressive, but it's also recognizing people and their rights. And the more that we get connected to people, and accepting and caring of people, we can see a larger way to identity. And I really appreciated this webinar today. I really appreciated seeing links between everybody, even though it's the one topic, how it connects on different levels. And again, how legal identity affects people differently based on who they are, who they see themselves as, and where you're located around the world. So I really appreciate that in this conversation. I would like to, if there's no more questions from the audience, if there's I want to give an opportunity, if there's a little question that maybe you would like to ask each other, or maybe ask somebody to expand a little bit more on one of the topics that each of you shared today, to go a little bit deeper. No. Tiegan, I'd like to ask you, just like a person, you don't have to, were you ever able to access your records like you wanted to? How your father, well, your birth father was prevented because he didn't have an ID. Were you able to eventually access the records that you wanted to?
Not currently, because we have no solution. We offered for one solution that we thought we could think of, well, if I can prove my legal identity, because I had that many documents, then if I've got a DNA test showing that he's my father, surely that's as good. But currently, um, I'm still in that weird position, and I think that is the nature of a lot of record holders. Because the other odd thing as well, in terms of legal identity, that I thought of while I was hearing everyone is, in this country at least, dead people can't give consent. So I've actually lost family members, and there is no way that their information will ever be unredacted because they can't give
Yeah.
consent. But yeah, currently, except hearing verbal, I've been able to get more birth family history verbally through my birth dad and other birth family members, which is incredible. And I'm in a really lucky position in terms of they've been willing and able to share, because I know not all of those who are care experienced have that, and I think either not always due to unwillingness, but some birth family members don't know their own history. So I have got it in one sense, but not in the other sense.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. I'm happy for you personally that you were able to connect with fur family members to be able to do that. And I'm sorry that the state is not cooperating that way. And I really appreciate that you speak out about this so that eventually something can be done. So maybe people, as you just said, that don't have access to birth family members to capture that history can also find a solution someday. And so the more we talk about it, the more people know about it, something can eventually be done to rectify that. So I appreciate that. I think we have one last question. Hi all, thanks for this wonderful insight. In a situation which is advocating for birth registration and legal identity categorized as national security, what are possible ways to speak from an activist point of view? Thanks in advance. That's
I can pick up that. So
okay.
if birth registration is a human right, then all human rights are subjected to restrictions or limitations, but those need to be proportional. So that means the legal aims or the restriction should be legitimate. Second, there should be a adequate relation of means and ends, and the solution should be the less restrictive. I don't think national security as a blanket argument actually meets the idea of proportionality. So the idea that you can do whatever in birth registration because of reasons of national security does not pass the muster of proportionality. So it would be an illegal restriction if there's no clear connection between the restriction and the ends. There were a couple of other questions up there. So that Maryann, that was the last one. There's two others.
Can I
Yes,
add a bit to what Kristen said?
yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to birth registration, it is for all residents. Like it's not only for citizens. So if a baby is born in a country, then like I don't see any reason why his or her birth should not be registered. His or her birth can be registered, like irrespective of the status of parents. Like I know a lot of cases where, like a baby's birth was registered even without the name of the mother and father. See what happens in case of harmlings. So practically there's nothing that should stop the birth registration of a baby, provided that baby was born or is born in that particular country. So that's the bottom line. Okay. And then there is a difference between birth registration and citizenship. Like the problem starts when you start combining the two. Okay. And then countries can really go into a difficult situation. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to ask this one question because I think it's very important and related. Some argue that there must be limits on social services, like requiring an ID or permanent address to access these services in order to prevent people from abusing, and I'm doing quotes because that's what it is. And as Lydia said, it's a myth. Abusing these services in order to prevent people from abusing the system. Is this even a legitimate issue? How does the panel respond to those who argue that it is?
I'm happy to take the first run at this.
Thank
I
you.
mean, that's something that we hear a lot in homeless services, this idea that people are refusing to get jobs, etc. Anytime someone brings that argument to me, I ask them if they've ever worked with this, population that's experiencing homelessness. And I also recognize there are instances in which I won't say abuse of the system happens, but there are instances in which folks are not sort of with good faith engaging with the services that are there to support them. So sometimes you do see instances of this, but it is isolated, and you should not completely throw out a system of support because a few people have not engaged with it in the way it was intended to be. So I think we can acknowledge isolated instances, reinforce the fact that people who are experiencing homelessness have had the system abuse them at multiple points along the way. By the time someone becomes homeless, they have been failed by the system so many times over and over and over. And so those are just some of the ways that I'll have that conversation with folks.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Couple of words on that too. One is the issue of one can take as a legitimate purpose the good use of social services and the limited funding of social services. That's a legitimate purpose from the perspective of an administration. But then the means to achieve that need to be flexible, particularly not reinforcing their circle of poverty. So sometimes lack of birth registration or lack of documents, lack of ID is an outcome, a consequence of poverty. And social services are mainly meant to serve poor people. So there you are adding two lacks of services in order to exclude someone from a service with the excuse that people are abusing. So flexibility means in some cases, many food banks, etc., actually have that premise, not to ask for IDs or not to ask for legal registration because this is people in need. So one needs to be very sensitive in the way in which devices access, particularly access to services that are meant to the ones that have been left behind. So one can say, well, there is a legitimate purpose in not spilling your scarce resources for people that don't deserve it. So, well, there has been a whole discussion about means testing. So, can you devise programs where means testing is an absolute barrier to the access, or it can be a prong, but not necessarily the last word in terms of access? And are you there not compounding a history of deprivation in order to actually punish someone because of the lack of an idea or lack of so I think that those are issues that need to be taken in account when you devise access to benefits or access to social services.
Thank you for that.
Can I also add something?
Yes, please.
The bottom line is whatever you have to do, be cognizant of the ground realities. Because of late, what has happened, national ID, national ID systems or national ID cards are being linked with social services. And I can tell you in most countries, national IDs are issued at age 18. So when I was in Tanzania, there is a sizable proportion of young mothers. So if you don't have a plan B for them, then, because of digitalization, you are adding to exclusion. And I have seen mothers running here and there, to get a letter from a village chief or someone, because, they don't have the national ID. And the same thing is happening with birth registration, because during birth registration, they're asking for the national ID of the mother and the father without sorting out the supply side issues. So that is becoming another barrier. So our recommendation is that, guys, even if you have to do this, when the mother comes for the registration of her pregnancy, that is the time you should ask for the national ID, so that both the supply side actors as well as the demand side actors will have 3 to 4, 5 months to get it done, rather than denying the birth of a baby just because, the mother doesn't have national ID. And then these days, unique ID numbers are being issued during birth registration, which is an excellent thing, because that is the way, in the process, you are able to establish an organic relationship between birth registration and the national ID system. Perfect. But then if you want to do that in real time and if you have logistical challenges, I was in Sierra Leone. Can you believe Sierra Leone used to have one of the best systems? If a baby was born in a mother, like in a health facility, declaration used to be completed, and in the next visit, mother used to get a copy of the birth certificate. Now, if you go to big hospitals in Freetown, you'll be surprised that there are stacks of forms. You know why? Because they are not in a position to issue unique ID numbers in real time. So they don't have plan B, plan C. So all these factors, like when you move towards digitalization, please always remember about your last mile populations.
Exactly. Wow. So I am so happy. I think this was an amazing conversation. I think that we are all the better for it who have got to sit here and listen to this discussion and the interactions between people. I would like to thank all of our panelists today for sharing their knowledge, their insight, their wisdom with us. To Bhaskar, Arli, Tiegan, Lydia, Christian, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing. I'd like to thank, excuse me, ATD Fourth World for putting on this webinar. Sorry, almost made it through the whole thing. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the NGO Committee for Social Development, Life Project for Youth, and the NGO Working Group to End Homelessness for also sponsoring this webinar today. I'd like to thank all of you who attended for sharing your time with us and for your thoughtful questions. Very soon, you'll be able to access the recording of this webinar online on the ATD Fourth World website. So please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues and networks. Once again, thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of our tech people behind the scenes. We are grateful for you. Have a good day and take care. Thank you.